Scaling a beauty brand takes more than just great product. It takes strategy, it takes operations, and a whole lot of planning. From demand forecasting to choosing the right retail partners, every decision can make or break your brand success. In this episode of Scaling Emerging Beauty, I sit down with Ashley Gilbert, an operations expert who's worked with brands like Glossier and the Lip Bar. Here's a snippet from our conversation.
In scaling, you have to be nimble.
Yeah.
Understand when it makes sense to kind of go from one priority view to another priority view. What does that mean for the e-commerce development process? One, you control your timelines. So if you are setting for retail, for Target, you are going to present in the late spring, early summer. Walmart has had some shifts, so now they're like late summer.
Let me tell you a little bit more about Ashley. Ashley is a true beauty enthusiast. She has an MBA and she's leveraged her background at big corporations where she had a lot of operations excellence and experience and brought that over into the beauty industry. I know you're going to absolutely love this conversation. We talk about all of the things that merge innovation and operations. So this is one that is great for brands regardless of your size. I'm really excited for you to listen to today's episode. Check it out after a word from our sponsor.
As of the published date of this episode, I am an associate of Ulta Beauty. The ideas and thoughts represented here are my own and not that of my employer.
I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor for the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast, the Emerson Group. Through their support, we're able to continue to talk to industry experts to provide early stage brands with strategies and tactical insights on what they can do to help their business grow better. Thank you again to the Emerson Group for their continued support. And let's go ahead and continue with the show. I'd love to start with just talking a little bit about your beginning steps in beauty. So you were at Glossier, you were on the operations side.
Yes. So came into beauty not because I like lip. Well, first of all, I've always been a fan of a red lip. So this is actually a new lip from the Lip Bar that's coming out, setting in February in your stores. I'm not going to give you the name yet, but I've always loved a good lip and I've always loved mascara. So when I transitioned to Glossier, I was coming from, I have a traditional sort of business background. I had just completed a general management rotational program that was in sort of the kind of like quasi-industrial or industrial adjacent space. I came out of that with some very strong and core operational and people skills, knowing that I never wanted to be in an industrial environment again.
I get it. I have a bachelor's in chemical engineering. I worked at a plant. I was like, this is not
literally. And when I say rotation, literally rotated from like running a customer service team to running a receiving team to running a stock keeping team to also kind of doing like special initiatives. And so like physically being in the warehouse, I would walk 15 to 20,000 steps a day, which is a lot in a 6 to 7 hour day, right? It's not like, the last 24 hours. No, like in this 6 to 8 hour time period. So left that with just really strong skills and understanding, not just sort of the operation skills and the people management skills, but the company that I worked for is still known for really being in tune with the customer experience. What does that customer experience look like from the moment they scroll on your website to when it's delivered to their door? So I took those three things and said, what next? And so I moved from Chicago to New York and decided that I wanted to work for a place where I was an end user of the product or service that was being made or pushed to market. And so beauty kind of naturally fell in my lap, given the network of people who worked at my previous company who were in sort of like the beauty or CPG space, particularly within the startup sort of ecosystem. And that was the other thing. I knew I wanted to work for a startup. So kind of literally letting the pendulum swing from massive company that has all of the processes in place, has all of the people in place. Your steps to any form of promotion or just sort of moving up within the organization are clear in terms of how to get
and lots of growth. I mean, that's the thing with startups. They move very quickly and the growth, for many of them, the path is there. So that
the path is there. So I knew that I wanted that too. I wanted to actually be a part of something that scaled in growth as opposed to just sort of consistently day over day looking at the minutia. And so through networking, Glossier became an opportunity that I pursued and took. Initially when I was hired, I think I was like employee like 85 or 88. So very early on.
Yeah.
I knew I was less than 100 for sure. It's when we were just like 2 floors on top of the space where we were actually, like, we were 2 floors of a 6-floor building. Like, so literally I just walked up the stairs to get to the office. It was tight. Like, we were sitting at open desk. It was still very much so tight, but it was still a very loving and kind team. But came in to help sort of set up and build out operations. When I was hired, there was the head of operations and then a coordinator, and I came in as a manager of operations. And literally while there, we moved from, I don't know if you've worked at companies where they've been a part of the warehouse move, but like for an e-commerce.
That is huge. Let's talk about that. Like, what is that like? Because many early stage brands are like, okay, they're either still making it in home or they're making it out of a smaller space. And then they're like, we need to scale this thing. So we need to move to a bigger place that can really house the growth.
Well, for Glossier at the time, it wasn't just finding. So when I came on, they were already in a warehouse. So they had a 3PL, a third party logistics provider, who they were working with. But they, at the time, like, the volume was just increasing pretty much exponentially on a month-over-month basis. And so it was a matter of, one, you always want good rates, right? Yes. Especially when your volume is picking up. But then also at the time, Glossier had one big sale a year. It wasn't until the last few years where they've transitioned to keeping up with other brands of like, we need promo throughout the year. Yeah. But there was one big sale a year. It was at Christmas. And so literally, they needed a warehouse that had the technology in place, the quality and controls in place, in the physical space, and in a region that had good labor to be able to support 10x volume over their day-to-day within a 4-day period. So
that's a huge flex to go from one level, if it's like 1,000 units.
And then suddenly you have tens of thousands of units on a daily basis. And so that was really the goal. So I was a part of warehouse moves, also setting up internal systems and processes in place, like, you know, moving from the thought of like, oh, I just need you to send this to me. It's like, nope, I need you to fill out this form. It needs to be approved. Where is it going? We need to be tracking that on the back end so that costs are appropriately allocated for finance and accounting. Like, really kind of bringing in like those systems in place to make it make sense for all the things that most customers don't think about and see. So in doing that, like, we kind of got to a point, we had a really good team and got to a point where things became stable for the most part, and started to hire on like demand planners to appropriately assist with demand planning, because it literally started off with sort of one person. And then as Glossier started to expand in different categories from just makeup to fragrance to demand planning, like, oh, you do need to demand plan for merch. This is a thing that's kicking off. So like now we actually need to be looking into that. And when you talk about makeup, your color and then like your complexion, right? So truly being a part of the process when sort of building out like, what does it look like to be able to support the behemoth of this beauty and of this sort of like beauty brand.
So I'm imagining you're at Glossier when they are experiencing huge growth. Color cosmetics company. So you have lots of SKUs, more than 10 for sure. Okay, more than 10 SKUs. How do you go about managing your demand planning when you have so many variables? And like, what are the processes even to say, let's lay the foundation for this? Like, how do you go about setting things in place so that you're setting yourself up well for the future?
Well, to kind of bring it forward a little bit more, because I'd say I've been a part of that process in more detail at the Lip Bar than I was at Glossier. For the Lip Bar, there's a few things. So one, you are looking at your current portfolio and saying, all right, what are our most, at a very basic level, what are the products that are doing well? And when you are in the process of developing concepts, well, let's take a step back. We're in the process of developing concepts for your innovation for the next set or for the next, we're focusing on 2026 now, because 2025 has already been approved and it's going to set in 6 weeks. Right. So we're focusing on 2026. So when you're thinking about things that are going to launch in 2026, you're like, okay, let's take a lip. All right. So if we want to do, I can't say what we're going to do, but let's say
lip A. Let's say
if you want to do lip A, your first step is to say, all right, so where does this fit within our portfolio? Where is it positioned within our portfolio? Is this going to be more skincare for lip A, or is this going to be more cosmetic? Going to be something that is highly pigmented? Or is this going to be something that is sort of like subtle and more nude, right? So literally requiring my team to portfolio map is what I call it. Doing a portfolio map and saying, because we've already positioned all of our other products. So if we're saying if Liquid Matte is highly cosmetic and highly pigmented, and we know that Shimmer Balm is more on the skincare side and not necessarily pigmented, and you're coming up with Lip A, where does this fit on our portfolio? And does it make sense for our current product offering? So rooting it in, does it make sense for our product offering? Which innately means, does it make sense for our customer?
Yeah.
And so when we decide, yes, we're going to move forward with this, you're reaching out to all your suppliers, you're getting their submissions for innovation, you are tweaking things to make it unique and specific to you and what you want. Are we making a claim? Are we not making a claim? What's the price point for it? That's also a huge...
What's that target retail?
What's the target retail price? Is this going to launch on e-commerce first so that you can get a year of data? Or is it immediately going to Target? Are we going to present for line review for Target and Walmart, which are two of our larger retail partners? And so when you're deciding, to your point of like colors, what makes sense for us, we look at that through the lens of what colors. So we have color categories. So these are your reds, these are your berries, these are your nudes, these are your oranges. Those are like the top four for the most part.
Yeah.
And then saying, so in retail, what shades perform best? In e-commerce, what shades perform best? And we know for sure for Lip A, which is what we're considering or what has currently been approved for development, we know that these are the ones for sure. We need shades that are in this family range to make it that we know that this is successful with our customer. For the lip bar, we're always keeping the Black woman in mind, first and foremost. So what looks good on a Black woman? And then after that point, we're saying, all right, let's fill in the gap.
Yeah.
And because we know when we say Black woman, that also means a lot of things in terms of shade and complexion and undertones, right? So that in itself, the beauty of being a Black woman or someone of the diaspora is that we know innately that's going to kind of cover a large range, right? But we fill in the blanks on the outer edges as well. So benchmarking against our own portfolio of what colors and shades make sense. And then also looking at your peer set. So if I'm making Lip A and, the goal is we're targeting this brand who we know is doing well in the same aisle that we're in.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what do they have? So a lot of this data is public information in terms of like what does well. And this is why it's also really important to have really solid relationships with your retail partners. So we, at the Lip Bar, we have a very strong sales team, and they're often able to they have good rapport with the buyers who are assigned to us. And so sometimes they'll get indications of like, I don't think this might do well, or this color isn't doing well. No, I wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
So you're getting those updates throughout the year and certainly throughout the line review process. And something that I don't know if this is true for all brands, but I can say for some of our retail partners, we have developed a cadence where we're able to give them kind of a preview before line review to get their idea of like, this, how are you feeling about this?
Which is so,
should we continue to develop this? Does this make sense? And very quickly they will tell us like, wouldn't do it, isn't, somebody else tried it, didn't work, or there's something there, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a guarantee that when you present it in the spring that it will be accepted or received. But so you're less looking for the things that they really love, but you certainly are listening to what they don't like at all, and to what doesn't make sense for what they're working on, for what their dollars they have to allocate. And so that's another huge part. And that's feedback that when we talk about sort of improvements and things that you're able to do once you do get enough scale, once you do get enough business, once you become a reliable vendor, you're able to start having those conversations and put yourself in a position to where it's like, it's not just me doing this for you, you're doing something for me. Like it becomes a two-way street for communication in terms of ensuring that your brand is successful at a retailer.
That's really critical information. I talk, especially being an ex-merchant myself at a few big retailers, I talk a lot about that brand-retailer relationship and how it really is a partnership. So if you have new innovation coming out, I would say share that with your merchants. Let them know, because they know their category well. So they're going to know, oh, this is going to do well, or I'm not so sure about that. I've seen that come and go. Mm-hmm. So I agree 100%. I'm curious, as you talk about that, once you scaled, when you're still on the e-commerce side, does that process look different? The process for evaluating what innovation you want to bring in, or how you scale it? Because even I think you dropped some huge nuggets on the demand planning side in terms of providing an example of how you can kind of categorize your items and then come up with a template of this is how this item sells. We think this item is going to fall somewhere around here. So on the side, if you're still e-commerce, still DTC, does that look different?
So yes and no. So I'm going to answer this question through the lens of the Lip Bar. And Melissa has spoken about this, so I feel comfortable kind of sharing it. We were certainly a digitally native brand. And then I think the uptick or the upswing of our success, took place in a lot of different ways due to television opportunities, and then certainly like getting in the door at Target. And then, for being really honest, Black Lives Matter, investing in Black beauty businesses, which is a whole nother podcast because obviously tides are turning, but we should actually talk about that separately.
Right.
But internally, we made a shift from an e-commerce first company to a retail first company. And so I'd say in scaling, you have to be nimble.
Yes.
And understand when it makes sense to kind of go from one priority view to another priority view. So I'm answering this question, understanding that I'm going to talk about e-commerce, but this is a revitalization of looking through e-commerce for us for this year, because we're now in a position where we can kind of go back and be more risk taking. So to answer your question, what does that mean for the e-commerce development process? One, you control your timelines. So if you are setting for retail for Target, you are going to present in the late spring, early summer. Walmart has had some shifts. So now they're like late summer, which is a whole other thing. That's late.
Yeah, that is late.
So specifically for beauty. So late summer.
That impacts timeline. So that's why you say that it's late, because then it's like you need to know what POs is in your production team. So
Literally.
that's why all of those things matter. Typically, retailers are kind of on the same
They're on the same
timeline,
cadence.
right? The same cadence. So when a big retailer shifts it back, it's like,
It's throwing things off in a month's difference, right? And our price points are slightly different. Like our assortments are different too. So it has a ripple effect when retailers go through org restructuring. But the beauty of focusing on e-commerce, you control your timelines. So you decide, do you want this to launch in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4? You have more control over, does it make sense to do 1 SKU or 2 SKU? So whenever you are innovating for retail, you have a set amount of space. Are you in a foot of space? Are you in 2 feet of space? Are you in 3 feet of space?
Right.
And your footprint is not the same in every single door.
It's not.
And it's not the same in each door. It might not even be the same in the same stores that are within the same 10-mile radius, right?
Yeah.
So literally everything is sort of different. Whereas for e-commerce, you have control over when it's going to come to market. For a brand like the Lip Bar, we still have to keep the retailer in mind. So there are some limitations, but we have control over when it comes to the market. We have control. You keep more of your margins, right? You're not spending it.
Yeah.
So there's huge benefit to that, where you might, if it's going to be e-com only, maybe you'll splurge a little bit more on what that component is. Maybe
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Splurge a little bit more on the colorways of the unit carton, of the design of the unit carton. Maybe you'll choose to tool something as opposed to getting something that's sort of like off the line, right?
Yeah.
And so you can be far more, I think, creative and agile with when you're creating product for just your e-commerce channel. Now, taking a step back, again, because the Lip Bar is in both, we never create anything for e-com only. That's not true, because the HBCU is such a the majority of things that we create are created with retail in mind at some point.
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is that you're able to prove yourself. You're able to say that, hey, well, we know you might be taking a chance on thinking of this product as something that might do well for the Lip Bar, but we have 12 months of data. We've sold this many units. Sometimes it might even be helpful to say that these people from these cities or these states were interested in this, because that correlates with where are you and what stores throughout the country. So placement,
even marketing,
marketing possibly. And so that makes sense from that standpoint when you're thinking of like, okay, I'm just creating for e-commerce, but I have to be thinking of the retailer in mind. But then you have products. What the Lip Bar always does is, annually we try to have 1 or 2 collabs a year. And so the beauty of that, so most recently the HBCU collection.
When was the Maelle and the Lip Bar collaboration? Was that earlier this year?
That was this year. That was over the summer.
Because that was also huge.
And that's always nice, because you have 2 Black brands. And there's synergy there.
Yeah.
Well,
Monique, still,
yeah,
she was founder. She was the founder,
she's
even
founder.
though, sold, but still.
But yeah, founder-led brands. And so we always try to do that once or twice a year. You just have far more leeway and freedom to kind of curate an experience for the customer and the product that you're creating.
I love that.
The meal collaboration also was interesting because, again, it's one of those things where that actually, even though it was sold online, it was sold for Target. It was designed for Target.
Yes.
So that's a prime example of, no, it's not like in our regular set, but there's just so many things to take into consideration when you have a limited edition SKU, right?
How does demand planning change when you do have a limited edition SKU like that? I know when I was a buyer or merchant at Anthropologie, there was always this fine line between, okay, we kind of want to sell out, but then we don't really want to sell out. Like, it's this fine line between sell-through where it's like, oh, we hit 80% sell-through. But then, like, if you hit 80% sell-through, if you have a 10-week selling period that you're expecting this thing to sell, and you hit 80% sell-through at week 4, you didn't buy enough.
Right.
So then you're like,
that looks silly.
And then you're like, well, I'm
marketing plans continue.
because you're like, I'm still planning on talking about this. And then it's like, well, when can we get another run? Is there time? Typically, by the time we get it off the boat,
there's never enough time.
It's like, okay, so it's a lost cause. So can you talk a little bit about how, if you are doing these limited editions, and I think this is so important. Let me give this context. I think more and more for emerging brands, DTC and e-commerce is going to be really important for these brands. And I say that because personal opinion, thoughts are my own. I think that is what's going to allow that really loyal customer to continue to come back. Like, oh, I can't get this at the store. Well, let me see what I can get on the site. This is still fun. This is unique. And so I think
gateway into the other.
Exactly. So I think that part of innovation is going to be so critical, but then I feel like it's really hard to plan. So what do you say is like a knocked out the ballpark, like this worked situation? How do you plan for it? And then how do you adjust if you're like, 80% sell through, like halfway through the sell period?
Well, that's amazing if you.
Can you get it just right? I don't know.
I've never had that since I've been there. So again, I think it's. So I'm trying to answer this through the lens of an emerging brand versus like you've been around and you have the data point.
Yeah.
So let me kind of come back. Emerging brands.
Yeah.
I think you have to be comfortable with having losses.
Oof. Well, the reality of it is like you're going to fail sometimes.
If you're going to do a limited edition anything, you have to decide up front how much money are you comfortable losing.
Yeah.
And so I say that because more often than not, if you're an emerging brand, you're going to order MOQ, minimum order quantity, whether that's the MOQ to fill, the MOQ for your packaging, and when I say packaging, there's two parts of packaging. There's the component itself, which has an MOQ, unless you're doing completely turnkey. And then there's usually an MOQ run for, for your unit carton manufacturers, they'll usually, if you have a good rapport with them, they're probably a little bit more flexible with you of like, okay, well, maybe I'll only print like 5,000 instead of my normal 10, but they're trying to keep business with you. So they're flexible over time. But unless so I guess one, you should probably opt for turnkey. So just to limit that.
Oh, that's good.
So turnkey means you are going to a contract manufacturer and usually you provide a brief of what product that you're trying to develop and they give you some sort of pre-formulated things. And then they say, this is the component that works within this unit price. And then you decide, all right, well, how much is this going to increase? How much do you want to personalize it? Right. But I think that's the biggest thing for an emerging brand is understanding what loss are you comfortable with? 2, you're probably better off ordering MOQ. And I think from the get-go, a lot of brands get really excited about like defining what good is. And so like, I want to sell 40,000 units. You might not be a 40,000 unit launch brand yet. And so being realistic, let's say MOQ is 5K or 10K, then make marketing plans around 5K or 10K. And then I think also planning in advance for what a solution is of saying like, all right, if we only sell through 80% within the expected 6-week period, you're accounting for, all right, well, maybe we're going to discount that last 20%. And so when you talk about
and
success,
build that into your margin,
you're
right?
building that in. And so you are not saying success is selling through 100% within 6 weeks. You're saying success is selling through 80%. And then we're accounting for the discount that we're going to give for this last 20%. And so I think being very realistic and understanding the big picture up front about that, and knowing that whenever as a brand you're discounting something, that's a loss. Your margins aren't as high once you
unless you plan for it. I know
unless you plan for it.
When I was at Anthro, I remember that we had some items that we planned to bring in on sale. Like had the retail marked at like $39.95, brought it in at $19.95 on sale. Because also, I mean, not saying that that's a thing, but for some folks, it's like, oh my gosh, 50% off. I mean, this is where girl math comes from. You're like, it's basically free.
Girl math.
You're like, I mean, I'm not even.
Sale plus sale equals free.
Basically. But it's like, if we're planning that, we know that our costing actually is set up so that at a $19.95 retail, we're still making 60, 70% margin versus having it at the $39.95. And I'm not saying, that's necessarily, to bring items in and bring it on markdown. But if you are bringing it to market and you're going to have it on markdown for a certain period, that can impact your margin. So to your point, if you're thinking custom packaging versus not, or whatever that quantity is, that can all impact those things.
Yeah, I think just understanding that until you have enough launches to where you understand what success looks like, I think just being very real and sort of level setting with what success is for where you are for that quarter of the year for your brand, because that changes quarter over quarter, right?
Yeah.
Like, you have a really bad quarter and you're like, oh shit, all right, we got to pivot. But if you have some really good quarters, then you're like, all right, well, let's take a little bit more risk. All right, let's spend more money in ads. Let's do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you get to a point where you're able to say, all right, well, I think we have enough out there that is sort of like stock componentry where we're like, now we've got enough funds where we can sort of start to personalize and do some tooling. So I think it's just kind of recognizing where you are.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about this, like stock packaging versus this custom tooling, because I know you've been at companies that have done both, and then we'll kind of get to wrap up here. So I'm curious because you've been on both sides. And maybe the difference is also, realistically, Glossier is definitely positioned as more of a prestige brand, whereas the Lip Bar is more masstige, if you will.
It's so interesting. So when I was at Glossier, we were definitely considering ourselves masstige. Like I can now.
The prices are not giving masstige. I mean, unless my wallet looks
2016, 2017.
Okay, you're right.
I'm thinking like almost a decade ago at this point.
Oh gosh. We were
I was like, I still have the files. Like no.
That's right.
Like then, now it's different because they're in Sephora. Of course they're different now, right? So when I think about, my perspective is rooted in where they were 8 years ago, right?
Okay.
But even still, to your point on having worked for very different brands, like Glossier was and is, again, I don't know what their development situation is like now, but at the time, there was so much value held in curation from the onset, or from concept to launch, the entire go-to-market experience. It's like we are curating an experience. We are curating from the visuals that you see, from like every level of detail.
It was intentional. I mean, I was a Glossier girl.
Yes, everything was intentional. Like the number of conversations that I was privy to in terms of like, well, what shade of pink?
Oh, trust me, I've been at a company where it's like, no, that's not pink enough. That's too red. That's too this. And you're like, is it that? Yes.
Or just the level of sort of talent with the designers, so the packaging designers, and just creative in general at Glossier was just chef's kiss, top notch. And so it was very different from the Lip Bar, whereas Glossier literally was rooted in experience, rooted in curation.
That was part of the brand
and even the ethos, and even the launch of the whole, the story of Emily starting Into the Gloss first and sort of saying like, all right, well, let's kind of get a vote, like get people's interest. What type of product would you want? What would you want this to look like? Like it literally started off as curation for the customer. Whereas for the Lip Bar, I was like, let's fill a gap in the market. right? Like I am a Black woman and let's find lips that work for Black women. Let's show Black women that you can wear any colored lip. That's very different when you're like, I'm filling a gap in the market versus like, I am curating an experience for a subset of people and slowly letting that expand, right? And then not to say that creating a lip or creating lips that work for Black women isn't creating an experience. But to your point, the ethos from the onset is just very, very different.
Yeah.
And so the lip bar, you know, I think for sure, you said you consider us masstige.
I would say masstige because the pricing, I think the pricing is not like CoverGirl.
It's not CoverGirl.
You know, no, it's not.
So it is absolutely masstige. And so I think we try to balance the combination of ensuring that things align with our brand. So we have the birdcage that Melissa designed and deciding when that shows up and how it shows up. So that usually for the most part that's tooling. That's, you know, whenever you see custom, right. It actually, that is customization. And then there's other times where, you know, we may not opt for the tooling depending on the product and depending on, is it going into retail or is it going to be like, how many doors is it going to go? And is this something that's going to Target and Walmart or is this just going to Target? So there's lots of kind of questions that kind of feed into that, because why does that matter? So literally, when we are costing out and considering what the cost of a product should be, there is your formula, there is the component itself, so the actual top, that cap that you unscrew, and
the top is not a custom color.
Yep. Then there is the unit carton itself. You know, are you getting a regular unit carton? Are you going to do a cutout so that you can see the some of the product, particularly if this is going into retail? Think about that for whenever all of your complexion products. You want to be able to see the shade. You as a Black woman want to be able to see.
I sure do.
If you're not in Sephora, you can't swatch that. So you're taking a huge gamble and saying, all right, well, this matches my color. Then there's a fee for everything. There's a fee for the safety seal. There's a fee for the bottom on the component.
You need when you're going into retail.
When you're going into
chain.
There's a fee for the color label that goes on the bottom of the component for the safety seal, and sometimes there's 2 safety seals. So it's just like everything has a cost. And so you take a step back. Every brand has standards for what they want their margins to be. And so when I spoke earlier about kind of drilling down into there's skincare, there's makeup. Within makeup, you have color, you have complexion. Drill down within color. Lips is a subcategory of color.
Right.
Face, eyes, brows, right? And so literally deciding what are your margins? What's your average margin for all of these categories and subcategories? And then from the onset, and this is important for emerging brands, from the onset deciding what's the minimum margin that you want for the category of products that you create. And so when you decide that I don't want a margin that's less than 80%, I don't want a margin that's less than 87%, I don't want a margin that's less than 67%, you're very quickly able to decide, do you want to spend the money on something that is tooled or mold versus like, give me what's on the shelf.
Yeah, that's really good though, because I've been saying more and more profitability is coming to the forefront of these beauty brands, because gone are the days, like in 2015, these brands could do things that weren't profitable.
Yeah.
And they were getting investment. Yeah. And it was like the money was flowing. And
the expectation was to spend.
It was.
Even if there wasn't a plan.
There wasn't profitability.
Like the runway is running.
And it just kept going. But it's a very different environment now. And so that's where these things that you're talking about, critical. And also some of the things that emerging brands, you almost, in some cases, you have to make those mistakes and say, oh, we went too custom on this. And I remember even when I was an independent consultant talking with a brand, and I said to them, is the cost for a colored cap, like the bottle, it was a hair care brand. I said, is the cost for a colored cap worth it? Because you go with white versus whatever the color was, call it, cerulean blue, because I love the Devil Wears Prada, right? Is that worth the additional visual appeal that you have on the shelf? And the answer might be yes. But you just really need to think, to your point, what's the minimum margin? Where is this going? all of those things should come into play so that it's not just a decision that's made almost on like feeling, because we're no longer in the feelings.
Small brands don't get to be in the feelings when you're trying to be profitable.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you feel, yes. We're human. We want you to feel, but there's a bottom line.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. I think something else that I think is important, and we're like management at Glossier, we talk a lot about this, is when you decide to, I don't want to say take a risk, but take the leap to do something custom. Being very clear on the reason. So the reason could be, from a retail perspective, you want it to pop out on shelf, because when you walk down an aisle, you are inundated with brands and colors and copy and wording and phrases and photos, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to be the brand that pops out, particularly if someone's coming down the aisle not looking for you, the brand. They're just looking for the product that your brand sells, right? So they're like, I just want a red lip. Well, shit, you go down the lip aisle.
There's so many options,
right?
Yeah.
So when you talk about customization and popping out, whether it's the color of the component, a cutout within the unit carton so that you show the color component, that is important. But something we also talk about is, particularly for small emerging brands, if you're going to spend the time during the development process, because it's not necessarily easy to color match also. Like, that's a whole nother scenario. Like, it's rounds and rounds sometimes of ensuring that the shade of that lip or the shade of that blush matches the component. If you're going to take the time and the money to do that customization, you also need to be prepared to make sure that your marketing dollars are highlighting that in some way. Don't let it be for naught, right? So
that's good.
Are you ensuring that when you're having photo shoots on the product, like, don't just give me a swatch. You need to showcase this component that you just spent an extra 30 cents a unit on, right? Like,
that's good.
When you're showing your advertising plans or your social media plans, you better be talking about when you're priming your influencers to create content for your social. Don't just start with the swipe. Yeah. Look at this beautiful top. Like, literally, like,
that's such a good point. I'm thinking to
oh, how pretty is it? You need to actively push that unboxing experience in terms of, like, put money behind it, not just let it be, oh, they opened it up when they received it from UPS and it's beautiful and pretty. Like, you actually need to push it and focus on why you chose to spend extra cents to bring this to market, to match this color. It needs to make sense. Don't just do it for the aisle. Do it for all aspects of your business where you can.
That's so good. Oh my gosh. So many good nuggets. Do you have any other closing advice that you would provide to emerging brands that are trying to scale their businesses in the mid-2020s and beyond? What advice would you have for those brands?
So I'm an operations girl at heart. So don't overlook the importance of having your systems and processes in place. I think if there's ever a place where it's worth, and often this is the last thing that brands do. Because they're like, they're here for the creative part. They're here for the output. They're here for, like, that final product. But I think there's one thing to be an emerging brand. There's another thing to be a successful emerging brand. And a successful emerging brand is able to quickly understand when they need to start balancing sort of the innards of their company, in addition to just sort of the output that they produce to the world. I think it's also really important to have people who can think high and low. I'm one of those people, and I say that without sort of like patting myself on the back, but my interests have been able to extend beyond just operations, and I've been able to successfully work with creative people, successfully be like that person who's able to see the through line of literally from concept to launch, because I'm able to think about the details and then zoom out and think about the customer experience. Zoom out and think about what's the business impact of this. Think about, oh, well, this is cool for this quarter. What does that mean for replenishment moving forward? So thinking not just now, but thinking later. So it's really important to have people who can sort of think high and low, particularly, most emerging brands, for the most part, unless they've just gotten a crazy infusion of dollars, have small teams. And so who you hire is really important, which is a whole nother episode.
Yeah. Ashley, thank you so much. This was such a great episode. I love innovation, and we've had a few episodes about this, but we haven't had any really talking about some of the more operations side of it. And I think to your last point, you did a great job of showing how both matter. Both things are important. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Ashley for coming on the show and sharing her knowledge today. I learned so much, and I love seeing the blend of innovation and operational excellence. Thank you again, Ashley, for being on the show. If you found this episode helpful, I encourage you to share it with a friend or colleague. Please leave me a review on Apple or Spotify podcasts. It ensures that the podcast gets seen more and more. And by the way, if you're still listening, thank you so much. You didn't have to stay for the full episode. I appreciate you being here. I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.